The global markets have imploded. Domestic and international economies are in meltdown. The world's leading nations have stopped cooperating. Military forces are on high alert across the globe. Trade routes have been blocked. Sanctions put in place. Brutally insular foreign policies have been implemented. What once seemed impossible in a modern technological age of advanced communication and harmonious international trading partnerships has happened. Globalization has collapsed. According to a Czech economist, banker, and commentator Mojmír Hampel, after 3 decades of openness and cooperation, the world is breaking into hostile blocks. But why? What happened? The rapid technological progress of the last 30 years laid the foundations for a far more global planet. The internet in particular connected people in every corner of the world in a way that would have seemed inconceivable even at the beginning of the new millennium when so many advances had been made. AI, mobile phones, 4G and 5G technology, blockchain, cryptocurrency, logistical freight networks, the mass migration and movement of people, knowledge sharing on a vast and unprecedented level. With these advancements come many and varied changes not just to the way the world does business with each other, but the way everyday people live their lives. However, rapid progress in any sector of society offers up any number of complex challenges. And it's how people adjust to these changes that matter the most. Like Jared Diamond, an American scientist, historian, and author, said in an interview with Sierra Magazine way back in 2005, technology causes problems as well as solves problems. Technology simply means increased power, which is why we have the global problems we face today. But before we go any further, we should ask ourselves the following questions. What is globalization? Why did it collapse? And why do we have to be wary of whatever will inevitably replace it? To answer those questions, we need to take a trip back in time. National Geographic defines globalization as how trade and technology made the world into a more connected and interdependent place where ideas, knowledge, information, goods and services spread around the globe. In the business sphere, the term encompasses integrated economies, free trade, and the free flow of capital among countries, and easy access to foreign resources, including labor markets, to maximize returns for the common good of citizens across the world. For many, globalization may sound like a relatively new concept, and in the bigger scheme of things, it most certainly is, or it was. The person credited with coining the term, German-born American economist Theodore Levitt, did so in 1983 in an article titled The Globalization of Markets. But in actual fact, the roots of globalization can be traced all the way back to the Silk Road, an ancient network of trade routes across China, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean, used between 50 BCE and 250 CE. We could also cite the Industrial Revolution as being another factor in the globalization movement. But the fall of the Soviet Union looms large. It was due to that momentous occasion in 1989 when so many ideological and geographical barriers that had stood in the way of international cooperation disappeared, that true globalization was allowed to flourish. Now the benefits of globalization are obvious. The global hiring firm Horizons, in August 2022, cited the following potential plus points: increased choice, higher quality goods, healthy competition, economies of scale, labor mobility, increased capital flows, and better international relations. Businesses in particular, they stated, can benefit from cost savings, international recruitment, and the exploitation of specific market opportunities for goods and services, not to mention expansion into other countries that help to spread the risks associated with volatile or collapsing markets across the world, all of which sounds undoubtedly like positive advancements. Who wouldn't want to have more choices, better goods and services, and opportunities to travel and expand on a personal and professional basis? But that really only touches the surface of the issue. For all the good and positive factors associated with globalization, there is a much darker reality that can be charted back as far as those early merchants who bartered their wares along the Silk Road. If we were to ask why globalization might be considered a bad thing, the most emphatic answer to that question is not as complex as it may seem. Trade disputes. Almost every major conflict before or after the Industrial Revolution can be directly or indirectly linked back to trade disputes, be it the Opium Wars of the mid-1800s, the Banana Wars of the late 1800s to the mid-1900s, World Wars I and II, to more modern geopolitical conflicts focused on natural resources, like the oil fields of Iraq. Powerful nations are fully prepared to go to war to protect their own economic interests. That's what makes globalization so dangerous, and why some governments have pursued protectionist policies that fly in the face of the spirit of international cooperation. Let's take a look at a few more modern examples. Why is China so hell-bent on invading Taiwan, for instance? Many would cite recent and not-so-recent history attesting to the fact that Taiwan was once considered Chinese territory. In fact, you could find some persuasive justifications that back up that claim. Most notably, some historical sources state that the province came under Chinese rule as far back as the 17th century. Since then, Taiwan has been colonized by Japan, came under the rule of Mao Zedong, and finally claimed independence after the Second World War. If the official rule of the Republic of China tag still applies to the country to this day. Others would point to Taiwan's industrial and technological capabilities as the true motivating forces behind a possible invasion. Namely and principally, Taiwan is the world's leading producer of semiconductors. But what are semiconductors, and why are they important in a video about globalization? They're important because semiconductors are a crucial component of almost every electronic device you use on a daily basis, be it your smartphone, tablet, laptop, or even the brake sensors in your car. None of them would be able to function without a semiconductor. CNBC reports that since 2021, Taiwan has dominated semiconductor manufacturing, accounting for more than 60% of the total global foundry revenue of the previous year. If China could get its hands on Taiwan's semiconductor manufacturing base, it would give it a huge advantage on the international stage. And this hasn't escaped the notice of other major players on the world stage, most notably the US. Historically an ally of Taiwan, the US has recently opened 4 new military bases in the Philippines, close to Taiwan and the South China Sea. Whether the Biden administration would consider direct military intervention, meaning potential conflict with China over Taiwan and its massive semiconductor market, is another matter. But what can't be denied is that it's a gutsy move on the global geopolitical chessboard nonetheless. Then we have allegations that Russia attempted to affect the outcome of the 2016 US election campaign and the 2018 midterm elections. But how would that have been possible? How could another country possibly influence the electorate of a different country? Through the internet, particularly social media, standard channels of global communication that are capable of bringing people together as well as driving them apart. According to a CNN report from October 2018, Russian oligarch Yevgeny Prigozhin and his companies set aside a staggering $35 million budget to disrupt the two campaigns. The conspiracy has a strategic goal, which continues to this day, to sow division and discord in the U.S. political system, said prosecutors in a criminal complaint brought against Prigozhin in the Eastern District of Virginia. The tactics were innovative and varied, with the aim of influencing voter trends. Allegedly, Prigozhin's millions enabled the Russians to buy social media analytics services, secure server space and domain names, plant online advertisements, and stage political rallies and protests in the U.S. They targeted political figures whose views and policies were thought to run counter to Russian interests on the world stage. And make no mistake, Prigozhin might have been officially indicted for his actions, but there's no doubt who endorsed the whole campaign: Vladimir Putin. None of the two case examples cited above would have been possible without globalization. And therein lies the heart of the problem and the reason why globalization was doomed to collapse. In the wrong hands, the technological advances that can foster greater harmony and prosperity can also be used for the opposite purposes. Not the collective good, but to promote the interests of one business or country to the detriment of all others. Let's look at a strictly hypothetical example that might hit closer to home. Suppose your company needs a certain natural resource to manufacture its goods. In a global economy, you can source it from a country on the other side of the world for a fraction of the cost that you could do so in your own country. The choice is obvious. You enter into an agreement with an overseas partner, the communication and supply chains are now in place, and while you might have to wait a little bit longer for delivery, the upfront savings are substantial. Same goes for supermarket chains. They can purchase produce from different countries thousands of miles away far cheaper than they can do so from local suppliers. Nowhere has this been felt more devastatingly than in the UK dairy trade. In a report from the Guardian newspaper from July 2023, they painted a harrowing picture of how globalization has decimated an entire industry. The inherent problem lies in the fact that most major supermarket chains want to sell their milk as a loss leader. They know consumers rarely buy milk as a standalone purchase. Rather, they use it in their morning breakfast cereal or put it in their tea, which naturally leads to a series of complementary purchases: breakfast cereal, tea bags, biscuits, etc. The upshot of which, in the most serious of cases, is that the supermarkets are prepared to sell milk at a lower price than it costs the dairy farmer to produce it. The solution: cheap overseas imports. Naturally, this is unsustainable and a huge detriment to the national economy. The huge number of dairy farms standing empty today and dairy farmers who've been bankrupt tell their own stories. But it's only part of a bigger problem. There's the issue of getting it from one place to the other. Food miles have been at the forefront of the globalization debate for years. Both sides cite the transportation costs involved in moving vast shipments of produce from one part of the world to another, the environmental impact in terms of jet fuel, or the potentially serious dietary consequences of eating food out of season, even if links to an increased chance of cancer have yet to be scientifically established. The statistics regarding food transportation are a flashpoint in the debate. Global food miles account for about 19% of total food system emissions from transport, production, and land use change. The transportation associated with vegetable and fruit consumption contributes 36% of food mile emissions, almost twice the greenhouse gases released during their actual production. Put simply, globalization can harm a country's businesses, agriculture, economy, and the daily lives of its citizens. If the international options weren't available, the powerful supermarket chains would have no other option but to negotiate a fair price with domestic suppliers that would not only see them stay in business but prosper, which could only be a good thing for the local economy. For those reasons, democracies around the world have decided that globalization might not be a good thing after all. And in many ways, democratic forms of government are defined by change. A newly elected party might have radically different policies from the previous government. A good example would be the Trump administration and the way it systematically dismantled legislation enacted by the Obama administration. The most notable of these is Medicare. Many would assume that providing access to health care to the poorer citizens in a society is a good and worthy thing, but not everyone agrees. And it highlights a far more endemic and serious issue. If the people can elect, re-elect, or vote out their leader every 4 years, then an entire country, even one as vast and powerful as the United States, could be left oscillating back and forth between one set of policies and another ad infinitum, without sufficient time to assess their merits or see if that policy is of actual benefit to wider society. This creates doubt and instability, and it can be directly linked to globalization. But perhaps more relevant to the theme of our video was Trump's unapologetic America First campaign. The policy stabbed at the very heart of globalization and all that it's founded upon. Protectionist policies that exclusively favor the U.S. economy can only harm international relations, some of which have prospered and benefited both parties for generations. We could also cite the Trump administration's battle with Chinese tech giant Huawei as another example of globalization gone very wrong. During his time in office, the then U.S. president placed huge sanctions against the firm on the grounds of national security. Put simply, Trump believed that the components in Huawei devices could be used against the U.S. for nefarious purposes. In a 2020 report from the Associated Press, Trump was quoted as telling Fox News, "We don't want their equipment in the United States because they spy on us." Whether there was any truth to that claim was never firmly established, but it's another good example of how global partnerships can not only sour, but perhaps open the door for illicit activities. All of which begs the question, did globalization simply bring nations too close together for comfort? Another interesting example from recent history was Brexit, the UK's decision to leave the European Union. This landmark and controversial referendum was fueled by an irrational fear of the consequences of increased globalization. Those in favor wanted out of the EU to protect their sovereignty and end what they felt were huge sums of money being sucked out of their economy to help lesser-off nations. To contextualize, they'd just been through a recession due to a global credit crisis and suffered some of the harshest austerity cuts in living memory. But even though the examples we've used are compelling, they only tell half the story about the somewhat inevitable collapse of globalization. Other persuasive factors have naturally influenced the thinking and decision-making of some of the leading industrial nations. But the COVID-19 pandemic may have been the final fatal nail in the globalization coffin. The reasons why are varied and complex. Most obviously, the pandemic triggered the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. At its core, globalization relies on complex links or global value chains, GVCs, that connect producers across multiple countries. They often use highly specialized intermediate goods or inputs produced by a single overseas supplier. COVID-19 severely disrupted those links. This made governments radically reassess their economic strategies in the short to medium term. If pandemics were to become the new norm and severe disruption to those supply chains commonplace, then they couldn't, for example, rely on cheap Chinese imports anymore. In response, Ursula von der Leyen the European Commission president called for a shortening of the global supply chains because the EU is too dependent on a few foreign suppliers. So perhaps it was the essential fragility of the global economy that led to its downfall. Since then, as countries around the world have slowly started to recover, some more slowly than others, the unforeseen obstacles have hastened the death knell for globalization. At the time of the making of this video, the war in Ukraine, Israel's bitter and bloody conflict with Hamas, and the Houthi attacks on freight vessels in the Red Sea are all factors that contributed to the demise of the concept, which 5 or 10 years ago looked as if it would be around forever. Now that we discussed why globalization collapsed, we need to take a look at what might replace it. First, let's return to Czech economist Mojmír Hampel, who we cited earlier. In his article for Geopolitical Information Services, or GIS, Hampel described 3 potential scenarios for the post-globalization world. The first is friend-shoring, or an attempt to combat the autocratic threats across the globe. Hampel sees the world's leading democracies cooperating through broader trade and political and security agreements. We could probably look at the EU, the World Trade Organization, or WTO, or BRICS as good examples of global cooperation, only not on such a far-reaching level as before. Whether these alliances would be formed with historical partners or new players on the international scene is yet to be established. But this would likely have even wider repercussions for the rest of the world. Smaller nations like Belarus and Lebanon might follow Ireland's model. Nigeria may ditch the Commonwealth and align itself with China. And what of Scotland? Or Ukraine post-war? The second scenario is much darker. The harsh protectionist measures we've already touched upon. Unfortunately, we've seen worrying signs of such policies emerge in recent years, perhaps best emphasized by how deeply far-right political groups have become entrenched in the political debate in countries like France and Italy, or the growing momentum behind Trump's re-election campaign. There are probably 2 trains of thought regarding this scenario, those in favor and those against. People who've seen a progressive lowering of the standard of living over the last 15 or 20 years, certainly since the last pre-COVID global recession of 2008 or 2009, will welcome policies that put them first. However, as was the case with the UK economy following Brexit, such policies can become isolationist and create deeper and wider problems in the longer term. Economically, it's become a disaster for the country in terms of falling standards of living, energy and house prices, education, and the free movement of people across mainland Europe and beyond. Meanwhile, citizens who've seen their energy bills soar and wages stagnate will not have lost sight of that correlation. The third scenario is even worse. Under pressure from deglobalization and all that entails, rising prices, aging populations, and falling living standards, most Western countries become semi-democratic or even autocratic. Here we can look at some of the harsh austerity cuts enacted by some governments following the global recession referenced previously to see that that's already a frightening reality. Cuts to essential services to pay for globalization brinksmanship that went terribly wrong. Let's suppose that Hampel's bleakest scenario comes true. What will the world look like in 5 or 10 years? Will we face the kind of nightmare situation described in geopolitical strategist Peter Zeihan's book, The End of the World is Just the Beginning? Among a slew of frightening predictions, Zeihan suggests that many countries will lack products that are now commonplace. Furthermore, those goods that can be produced or imported will become more expensive, exacerbating the cost of living crisis that many people are currently experiencing in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Worse still, some technologies will no longer be accessible to us, and hunger will spread to many corners of the planet where a lack of food or even famine has never been felt before. Chillingly, the author concludes that we may not be in the midst of a deglobalization or deindustrialization process, but decivilization. Is this a terrible and imminent reality, or a sensationalized worst-case scenario that is hugely unlikely to come true? With so many crucial factors on a knife edge, it's hard to predict with any degree of certainty. But if we flip the argument on its head, could the collapse of globalization actually be a good thing? In an editorial piece for Forbes in 2020, Michael Sullivan suggested that it may well create a more values-driven world, with countries having a greater choice in terms of the path to follow. Could a getting your house in order first approach really have a positive impact on a greater number of people in a greater number of countries? No matter what side of the political fence you stand on, globalization did neither of those things. It created wealth for the wealthy and kept those impoverished in poverty. But with the infrastructure and technology in place, can we expect to see a new model take the place of globalization? As mentioned, there are simply too many impermeable factors potentially at play to look too far beyond the end of the war in Ukraine and a ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, or perhaps even more tellingly, the presidential election in the US near the end of the year. What is certain is that the world has now become a less connected and interdependent place than it has been for the last 30 or more years. Where that leaves the governments, businesses large and small, not to mention the citizens of the world, remains to be seen. Now go ahead and check out this video, or maybe this one instead.